Hello, today we're going to talk very briefly about an introduction to slavery in the United States. You should have this paper in front of you that says A Partial History of Slavery in the United States. And we'll take a look at how slavery was started here, how that leads us into a lot of problems in the middle 1800s. First of all, let's start with this. The first slaves from Africa arrived in Virginia in 1619. That's, of course, a long time ago, almost 400 years ago, if we're coming up on the 400th anniversary. So why is that year significant? Well, let's put this into context. 1620 is when the first pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts. The pilgrims came here on the Mayflower. We often think of them as being the very beginning of American history in a lot of ways. But there was slavery in America even before the pilgrims got here. Now, not all slavery in America was people of African descent. At one time, an indentured servant could be, often was of European background. This was a type of slave who would often come from Europe. They would not have the money to arrive here in America or be transported here, so they would sell their labor for usually 7 years. But an indentured servant is really not the same as a slave. An indentured servant knew they would be free eventually, and an indentured servant had some rights that slaves didn't have. It's not as bad as being a slave who is going to be a slave forever. At one time in America, all 13 original colonies allowed slavery. We were British, of course, when America first started. The British Empire allowed slavery, and it was true that all 13 colonies, including Pennsylvania, at one time allowed slavery. There were a lot of people in America concerned about the moral issues of slavery, and slowly but surely the northern states began to abolish it or eliminate it early on. When we came to writing our own Constitution in 1787 after the Revolution, the Founding Fathers agreed on a lot of things. They created 3 branches of government. They did a lot of things that were good for America, but they couldn't agree on the slavery issue. We compromised on the slavery issue in 1787 when we wrote our Constitution. We call this the 3/5 Compromise. Southerners wanted slaves to count for population because that would give them more power in the Congress. Northerners didn't want that because it would cheapen their power. Northerners wanted to count slaves for taxation purposes. Southerners, of course, didn't want that because it would cost them more in tax money. So the compromise they reached was that every slave would count as 3/5 of a person, or 5 slaves would count as 3 people. That compromise settled the slavery issue at least for a while, and as we began to add new states to our country, we always tried to add them in a balance of slave and free states. So when we added new states to the Union, certainly as we continued moving west and moving south, we tried to always keep a slave state and a free state joining the country at the same time. That worked for a while, but it couldn't last forever. And number 5 here says that balance couldn't last forever as acknowledged by the Missouri Compromise. We have studied this in class already. The Missouri Compromise came about in 1820 when Missouri wanted to enter the country as a slave state, but there was no matching partner free state to join as well. So the Congress, Henry Clay, and others came up with a compromise, very important compromise, allowing Missouri to enter the country as a slave state. They broke Maine off of Massachusetts and created Maine to be a free state. And then, knowing we couldn't continue to add free and slave states at the same time, they decided to draw a line across the country at the 36th 30 parallel, dividing the Louisiana Territory into future slave and free states. New lines, or new states north of that Missouri Compromise line would be free. Any new states south of that line would be slave. And we thought for a while that would kind of settle things. Southerners agreed to the compromise, Northerners agreed to it. Neither side gets exactly what they want, but it does help solve our problems for a little while. It gave us another 30 years, really, or 40 years to solve our differences over slavery. Number 6, slowly in the late 1700s and early 1800s, many northern states outlawed slavery. Many of those northern states didn't really have slaves anyway, especially in Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, a lot of New York. There were some slaves in some of those northern states, but really not very many. Slavery didn't really work in those areas. There were people who worked very hard to get their states to outlaw slavery. Number 7 says anyone who wanted to eliminate slavery throughout America was known as an abolitionist. That's a big word, and it's a very important word in American history. Abolitionists want to abolish slavery. If you are abolishing something, you are totally getting rid of it and destroying it. And so abolitionists want to get rid of slavery everywhere. Well, the Missouri Compromise lasts until California wants to become a state during the California Gold Rush years. When California enters the Union, we have a new problem. California was not in the Louisiana Territory, and so this Louisiana Territory line we mentioned up here doesn't work for California. And so California, because most people who went there during the Gold Rush were from a non-slavery background, California wants to enter the country as a free state. Southerners, of course, are very unhappy about that. In fact, South Carolina threatens to withdraw from the country altogether. John C. Calhoun and others have to finally work out a compromise known as the Compromise of 1850. Like every compromise, some states, or all the states, get something of what they want, but not everything. So to keep the country from falling apart and to keep us together, the Compromise of 1850 promises a couple of things to each side. What pleases the North about the Compromise of 1850 is that California will be allowed to enter as a free state. Most Californians have a freedom background, not many are from a slavery background. The Southerners really don't like this, but they're going to get something different. Instead of that line from the Missouri Compromise deciding whether new states will be slave or free, Southern states are going to get this. New Mexico and Utah, when they're ready to become states, they will vote to see if they will be slave or free. This is a philosophy called popular sovereignty. Popular means the people. Sovereignty means rule. The people rule. It seems to make sense that people in new states will be able to vote whether they are slave or free. Sounds like a good idea. Why have a line drawn on a map decide if your state is slave or free? Or why have Congress in Washington far away decide if your state is slave or free? Why not have the people who live in those territories decide if they will be slave or free? Well, when we actually put this principle into practice for the first time, it's a disaster. That story will come later. Back to the northern side, slave trade is going to be outlawed in Washington, D.C. The Northerners like this. Slave trade is being outlawed in Washington, D.C. This is a big move for the abolitionists and the freedom people because they're currently building, as this compromise is being reached, building a new dome on the Capitol building. Most of you have been there. You have seen this statue on the top of the building, or you've seen this plaster mold of a statue inside the Capitol building where we have been to visit. This statue is called Freedom. If you are going to put a statue called Freedom on top of your Capitol building, you cannot have slave trading going on in the city of Washington. That would be completely hypocritical. In fact, there was a slave market right across the street from the U.S. Capitol at the time of the 1850 Compromise. Southerners are going to get this. Slavery will still be allowed in Washington, just buying and selling slaves will no longer be allowed. Finally, the thing that the Southerners really want is a thing called the Fugitive Slave Law. A fugitive slave is a runaway slave. And if a slave runs away, according to the Compromise of 1850, they no longer can be free simply by getting to the north. A slave who escapes slavery now is no longer free. If they are captured in the north, they can be sent back to the south and slavery, no matter how long they have been living in the north. This is a real controversy. Southerners love it. They want to send bounty hunters up to the north to capture all their escaped slaves. But Northerners hate it because the law requires any former slave Even one like William Goodrich in York, who has been escaped from slavery since he was a small child. He doesn't even remember being a slave. But people who know him are required by the fugitive slave law to turn him in to return him to slavery in the South. This is what gives the Underground Railroad a big growth, a big period of growth in the North, starting with the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. In fact, let me show you a couple of pictures about the Fugitive Slave Law and how the Underground Railroad is really important in York County. York County in Pennsylvania, because we are right across the Mason-Dixon line from Maryland, is free territory. And maybe thousands of slaves trying to escape to the north or to Canada were headed for Pennsylvania. People who helped with the Underground Railroad are not really operating a railroad, and they're not really underground. It's underground because it's secret. And it's a railroad because they use railroad terms to cover their illegal activity in helping slaves escape. These are a couple of notices like might have been printed in newspapers by masters whose slaves had escaped and they're trying to get them back. $150 reward for a man named Tom. This one even says, the police in Boston are some of the kidnappers and slave catchers. Beware, do not talk to the policeman if you are an escaped slave. On this map, you'll see a bunch of orangish lines. These are Underground Railroad lines, and you can see that some of them exist right here in York County, Pennsylvania. On this map, here's Pennsylvania. And if we make this a little bigger, in Pennsylvania, here's York County. Here are the Appalachian Mountains. If you're a slave living west of the mountains, you're going to head for Erie and Canada from there, because you can't stay in America and be free. You have to get out of the country. Slaves east of the mountains are going to head towards Philadelphia, where you can get on a ship in Philadelphia and you can go anywhere in the world. So a lot of those slaves east of the mountains, which most slaves are going to be heading across York County, trying to get to Wrightsville, to cross the Susquehanna River on a bridge, and get to Philadelphia. So in York County, there are all kinds of little towns that would have had places where slaves knew to go to escape to their freedom, trying to get across the county without being detected. The hard part is getting across the bridge at Wrightsville because the Susquehanna River is about a mile wide and a very fast current. So you can't just walk across the river. You're going to have to get across the river on a bridge somehow. If you can make it through these different towns, you could possibly cross the river at Harrisburg, but it's a very dangerous thing to do. So a couple of pictures real quick of locations in the city of York or nearby that were known for their Underground Railroad activity. There's not time to go into all of those right now. Maybe at some future point we will. But these are houses that still exist that we know were used for Underground Railroad locations in the city of York or on East Market Street heading out of town. The goal was to get to that bridge across the Susquehanna River. These bridge pilings, if you drive across the Route 30 bridge across the Susquehanna, those bridge pilings are still there. There is no bridge on them right now, but that's where there was a long 1 mile and something covered bridge. You can see here's some of the bridge pilings for the old covered bridge that slaves were trying to get across the river. And some slave catchers thought that the bridge and the people in Wrightsville were so effective at sneaking slaves out of slavery that maybe that term Underground Railroad came here from York County. Because slave catchers would tell the masters that they lost track of the slaves because when they get to York, they seem to disappear as if on an underground railroad.